Well, hello to everyone watching, wherever you may be. My name is Michael Kugelman. I'm the Senior Associate for South Asia and the Deputy Director for the Asia Program at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. This is the latest virtual public event that the Wilson Center has produced since we shifted to remote operations several months ago. These events require a whole lot of time and effort from the Wilson Center's very efficient but very busy multimedia team. So I want to thank John Tyler and his team with the Wilson Center multimedia staff. And I also want to thank the Wilson Center's Middle East program, the institutional co-sponsor for this event. The focus of our discussion today is on the potential economic impacts of COVID-19 in South Asia. Every day for many weeks, we have all been thinking about and worrying about the coronavirus pandemic. One of the reasons why it's so worrisome, obviously aside from its deadliness and infectiousness, is that there is so much that we don't know. We don't know when there will be a vaccine. We don't know how long COVID-19 will be with us. We don't know if and when there will be new waves of the pandemic later this year. But if there's one thing about the pandemic that we can say with something close to certainty, it is that there will be real and lasting and deleterious economic impacts, at least in the short term. And Asia is a particular region of concern. Earlier this month, my Wilson Center colleague, Shihoko Goto, hosted a virtual event with Yasuyuki Sawada, the chief economist of the Asian Development Bank, and he projected that growth in developing Asia will fall from 5.2% last year to 2.2% this year. Many experts also expect South Asia to take a significant hit. One of the gloomiest predictions comes from the World Bank, which forecasts the worst economic performance in the region in 40 years. And broadly speaking, South Asia experiences significant levels of poverty, as well as infrastructural and connectivity constraints. So the economic vulnerability of South Asia in the face of the pandemic is plain to see. And there's been much commentary, for good reason, about the economic impacts of COVID on the US, on China, on Europe, among other places. But discussion about the impacts in South Asia is important too, given that this region hosts more than 20% of the world's population and nearly 20% of global economic growth. And the region is highly consequential for US interests. It is home to a key US partner in the US Indo-Pacific strategy. It is home to a terrible, unending US-led war. And it's also a key theater for investments and other types of activities by China, of course, America's top strategic rival. So we're very fortunate to have with us today a terrific panel that will weigh in on potential short and longer term impacts of the coronavirus pandemic in South Asia. And we wanted to take advantage of the technology that we have at our disposal in these extraordinary times to take this discussion about South Asia to South Asia instead of just counting on experts based here in the US. So accordingly, our panelists are all senior economists in 4 different countries in the region, and each of them will discuss potential economic impacts of the pandemic in their respective countries, which are Afghanistan, Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. And these are, of course, countries with varying economic conditions and realities, to put it mildly. So I'll introduce the panelists, but very briefly, as you should all be able to see their bios on your screen if you scroll down a bit. So first, we'll be hearing from Dr. Azam Chaudhry, who is Professor of Economics and Dean of the Faculty of Economics at the Lahore School of Economics in Lahore, Pakistan. He teaches undergraduate and graduate econometrics and macroeconomics. We will then have 2 co-presenters in Afghanistan. The first one is Dr. Omar Joya. He's an economist and head of research at the Biruni Institute, an economic policy research organization in Kabul, Afghanistan. He is also a visiting research fellow at Oxford and an affiliated researcher with the University of Bordeaux's research unit. Our second co-presenter from Afghanistan is Nazir Kabiri, who is executive director of the Biruni Institute. Previously, he was a senior policy advisor to Afghanistan's finance ministry. We will also be hearing from Dr. Hassan Mansour, who is founding and executive director of the Policy Research Institute in Dhaka, Bangladesh. Previously, he had a long career at the International Monetary Fund that entailed work on countries in Asia, but also Africa, Central America, and the Middle East. And finally, we have with us Dr. Ela Patnaik, who is a professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy in New Delhi, India. Previously, she was the principal economic advisor to the government of India. She has also held posts at the National Council of Applied Economic Research and the Indian Council for Research in International Economic Relations, and she was previously an economics editor at the Indian Express newspaper. So the format will be brief opening comments from each of our panelists. I may then ask a few questions, and then we'll go to a Q&A with questions from Twitter and email. So for all of you watching right now, please, if you have a question, please tweet it to the Wilson Center's Asia Program Twitter handle, which is @Asia Program, all one word, or you can email your question to asia@wilsoncenter.org. So with that, no one tuned in to listen to me talk. We want to hear from the experts. So I will stop there, and I will recognize our first speaker, which will be Dr. Chaudhry. So let's go to Dr. Chaudhry in Lahore.
Thank you, Michael. Wanted to thank the Wilson Center. I wanted to thank Michael Kugelman and his colleagues, Jared Thompson, and all in the IT Center. I think this is a really unique opportunity and an opportunity for us to discuss with my colleagues what we think is the future of South Asia, especially during this pandemic. Just a few things I think we're now realizing. We knew it for a while that this is, I think, an era-defining moment. I think this is something most of us have not seen in our lifetimes. And I think one of the ways I look at it, and we're looking at it in Pakistan and globally, is a lot of the shocks, the economic shocks that we've seen before have been demand-side shocks. This is a very different type of shock. This is a supply-side shock. Workers are at home, factories are shut. And I think that has very significant implications for people, for corporations, for governments. It also means that a lot of the interventions we think of, monetary, fiscal, et cetera, government-related policies may not be as effective as they have been in previous shocks. I'd also like to just spend a minute or two discussing some of the things which I think are important in the Pakistani context. One is 80% of the Pakistani economy is driven by consumption, and we see workers at home, people at home, a huge drop in consumption. That's going to have a very significant impact on the Pakistan economy and all economies. Second is that the Pakistani economy has transitioned over the last few decades, and now almost 2/3 of the economy is made up by the services sector. And I have a feeling that the services sector is being especially hammered right now, and I think that's going to have a major implications for poverty, for employment, and for economic growth. We at the Lahore School of Economics have a macro model, and in our macro model, we foresee, as Michael was talking about global growth estimates, we actually see a 3% drop in Pakistani GDP, and that's a conservative estimate. That's if there's a lockdown for 3 months, a few months with a gradual reopening of the economy. A longer lockdown of about 6 months could take it up to almost 4% drop in GDP, and this could go up to 6% drop if we go beyond the 3 to 6 month period. Also, we're predicting something like 1.5 million jobs lost. And that's a really massive number, between 1.5 to 2 to 2.5 million jobs lost right away in the first round of impacts of the pandemic. I think when we're talking about economic impacts, we especially in a developing country context, one of the things we worry most about is poverty. There's a huge amount of people in Pakistan and all of South Asia and in a lot of the developing world who are hovering around the poverty line. So if you look at, either estimates by institutions like ours, the Lahore School, or if you look at estimates by the World Bank, it's the poverty head count is about 4% in Pakistan. But with this huge shock, we foresee, another 3.5 to 4 million people being thrust into poverty over the next, 3, 6, 9 months. So what we're talking about is, a 4% poverty rate jumping up to about 5.5 to 6%. that's a huge number. I mean, I think you're talking about major implications for people. We estimate, the government is trying to do it. The government already has programs to help the low income and poor people. The government is planning to roll out another program, the SAS program, which they want to give something like $12 or $75 over the next couple of months to something like 12 million people. The problem is the money. Does the government have that money? Is something that we're thinking about. And secondly, how would they distribute that money? It's a huge problem, trying to distribute money and getting it in the right hands. Right. Also, I mean, just a few more important points, to spur the discussion on is Pakistan, is in the midst of an IMF bailout program. So, we've got our IMF conditionalities. And the reason we're in that program is, that we before the pandemic had about $25 billion worth of exports. If, imports was probably close to, 40 to 45 billion. So you had this 20 billion gap, which before the pandemic, because of the fall in oil prices and the depreciation of the Pakistan rupee, had fallen to about 15 billion. We see, I think there's been this huge drop in demand. You see, shops going out of business and whole departmental stores going out of business and chains going out of business. Huge implications for developing countries like Pakistan that have produced textiles. Bangladesh and India and Vietnam and all are experiencing this. So we foresee, a significant drop in exports. Imports are falling because oil prices are falling and also incomes abroad are falling. But the reason I bring this up is that there's still going to be this huge pressure on the balance of payments. And I think we're still going to have to be following a lot of the IMF's dictated terms, especially in terms of budget deficits and what impact that can have on potential bailout packages. And one of the last things I did want to mention is that Pakistan is lucky, unlike a lot of countries, that it's self-sufficient when it comes to food. We grow our own wheat, we grow enough wheat, rice, food for people. But there's a huge urban poor population, which is not going to be going out into the fields and being, harvesting food and getting payment in terms of wheat or rice. I think one has to figure out ways of addressing the urban poverty. Also, I think one of the things you have to realize is that the Pakistani healthcare sector is extremely weak. And I think, if the pandemic, which has been relatively, the impact has been relatively muted, especially what you see in terms of what you see abroad, I think it could have really major implications on overwhelming the healthcare system. And, and since we're online and we're all teaching online also, I think there are going to be huge impacts on education. And all of this will feed into inequality also. So we're talking about incomes, we're talking about poverty, we're talking about inequality. So I'm gonna stop there, but I think this is a really important point to talk about, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chaudhry. Some really great comments to kick off the discussion. So now let's go to Kabul, where we'll hear from our co-presenters, Dr. Joya and Mr. Kabiri. I'm not sure which one of you would like to go first, but the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for inviting us. We're very glad to attend this webinar hosted by Wilson Center. I'll speak first. I'm Omar Joya. I'll speak first, and then my colleague Nazir Kabiri will speak about the regional dimensions of the pandemic. But my talk will be mostly concentrated on the economic aspects of the current crisis. But let me first give a very brief context to those who are unfamiliar with the Afghan economy or who have not been following some recent political and economic developments in the country. Currently, we are going through three simultaneous crises. First being conflict and security. We are in the midst of conflict. Just this week, there were 3 to 4 attacks, one on a hospital, and there were several civilians that were killed, especially women and newborn babies, actually. Second, we are in the midst of a political crisis. There have been dispute over election results, and the dispute is still ongoing, and the two claimants of the Elections have not reached any political resolution so far. And the third is the economic crisis triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. So far in Afghanistan, the impact of the COVID-19 has been relatively limited and muted for some reasons. There have been so far around 6,000 cases, confirmed cases only, but this number could be strongly underreported because of under-testing and so many other reasons. I think Afghanistan in South Asia, it sort of stands alone. And that's because of 3 to 4 structural characteristics of the economy, which you don't see in other South Asian economies. So the first being a high dependence on aid. Around 60% of our budget is financed by donor grants. But apart from the government budget, there are huge off-budget expenditures in the country which are directly supported by the donors. So if we take into account those off-budget expenditures, in addition to the government budget, then we see that 75% of public spending in the country is financed by donor grants. So that's the first distinct feature that I'm highlighting. The second is that here in Afghanistan, the government does not have access to alternative financing sources. Unlike other countries, which could actually tap into domestic financial markets where there are some opportunities for borrowing, or they could actually perhaps borrow globally. The Afghan government cannot borrow domestically, so there are no domestic financing, alternative financing sources available at all. So these two, high dependence on aid and lack of alternative financing sources means that there's no fiscal space for the government to actually use any sort of fiscal expansionary policy if it would want to in response to the current economic crisis. And the fact that it cannot find any alternative financing sources when domestic revenues are declining as a result of economic recession. The third distinct feature of the Afghan economy is a high dependence on imported food. We are not self-sufficient in the very basic food staples. We import almost all of our food products from abroad, including wheat. We import almost all of our wheat requirements from Kazakhstan and then from Pakistan. And also we import rice from India and Pakistan. So risks to food security in Afghanistan is actually quite high. And I think this is unmatched in the region. Now, with this said, let me give a very brief economic outlook. So we went out with our economic outlook report in early April, and we developed 2 scenarios using a macroeconomic model that we have developed. So in a moderate scenario where the COVID-19 pandemic would be sort of contained by summer, let's say, and that disruptions to trade will be only temporarily. In that case, we expect an economic contraction of 3.3%, similar to what Dr. Chaudhry mentioned about their forecast for the Pakistan's economy. So in a moderate scenario, we expect a 3% economic contraction this year. But if the pandemic worsens and if we experience a much persistent disruptions to trade and international movement of goods, then in that case, the economic contraction could be as large as 10% this year. On domestic revenues, we expect that revenues would decline quite substantially in Afghanistan. Even in the first 4 months of the fiscal year, domestic revenues were down by 25% compared to the first 4 months of the previous year. So Afghanistan will be facing a full-fledged fiscal crisis this year, unfortunately. And then the third, because of high dependence on imported food, we expect a rising inflation in the country, with inflation could go as high as 25%, with food prices jumping to around 40 to 45% this year in a severe scenario for COVID-19. And that's very similar to what we experienced during the 2007 and 2008 global food prices crisis. And then finally, I think the distributional impacts of the economic recession would be very severe in Afghanistan. Poverty rate was already very high at 55%. Now, if the economy experiences a recession of anywhere between 3 to 10%, then in that case, we expect an additional 8 million people to fall below the poverty line, pushing the poverty rate from the current rate of 55% up to 80%. So I think the implications of the COVID-19, the economic implications of it on the Afghan economy would be much, much devastating than many other economies in South Asia, given the high vulnerabilities that we have in the region.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I will use the remaining amount of time to perhaps share some perspective on the regional dynamics of this pandemic. Our understanding is that poverty in the region will worsen the pandemic. Millions of daily wagers cannot observe lockdown for too long, as it has already been the case in Afghanistan. Second, AFPAC trade remains very limited at the moment due to the new restrictions imposed at the borders. Thousands of Afghanistan containers stranded in Pakistan. Afghanistan at the moment cannot export to Pakistan. The third is, as far as South Asia is concerned, and Afghanistan being in the western sub-region in South Asia, for us, South Asia doesn't move forward beyond Pakistan due to the historical rivalries between India and Pakistan. Fourth, our understanding is that the chances that COVID-19 pandemic going to unlock the full potential for regional cooperation remains very low. The political dynamics of the situation in the region is as such that full and durable regional cooperation is not applicable in foreseeable future. Political rivalry in the region is very deep-rooted. COVID-19 will not encourage regionalism as we just see the current trends. It will further encourage nationalistic and inward policies. COVID-19 is not going to change any geopolitical fault lines in South Asia. And sixth, if the virus gets out of control in Afghanistan, so will the country. Failure in Afghanistan will have serious implications on the region. And really quickly, in terms of some recommendations, we suggest a joint research program, a joint regional research program for perhaps for the development of a vaccine, as India are already taking the lead on that. The Prime Minister Modi perhaps announced a program that they could start soon. The second is, I think it's very important to keep the borders open with Afghanistan to let the trade flow. And that has to do a lot with the food security. And the third is that the situation in Afghanistan requires a collective attention by all of us. Fighting Corona and post-Corona recovery in Afghanistan calls upon all of us in this region to collaborate and assist as much as possible. To start with, let's put our regional differences aside when it comes to the Afghan peace process. This is immediate. A peaceful Afghanistan is in the best interest of all. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to both Dr. Joya and Mr. Kabiria for a very interesting, troubling and depressing presentation, though I think also very, very realistic. So thank you for that. We're in just a second, we'll go to Dr. Mansour in Dhaka, though first, just a reminder to all of those watching, if you'd like to pose a question to our panel, you should tweet it to the Asia Program Twitter handle, which is @Asia Program, or you can email your question to asia@wilsoncenter.org, and we'll get to your questions after we finish up with the panel. But let's now go to Dr. Mansour.
Start with a little bit of background. The Bangladesh economy has been doing very well in the last 1 or 2 decades. It has increased its growth on average from 5% in the 1990s to 6% in the year 2000 plus, and then thereafter 7 to 8%. So most recent was 8.2% last year. So in that background, this pandemic has definitely caused a great disappointment and a havoc in the economic management, and also in the improvement, the gains made on the social front and economic front, that has been challenged very significantly. What we see is that this pandemic has impacted Bangladesh economy on 2 sides. One is the external side, the external shock from export shortfall, and initially before that it was sourcing of the export materials because it started in China. So it was external supply shock, then it became an external demand shock when Western Europe and North America got impacted. Right, actually 78% of Bangladesh export goes to these 2 destinations: European Union 62%, and United States and North America together, Canada together is about 18-19%. So that's a huge shock for our export basket. And then came the lockdown, and it created the demand shock on the domestic economy. So it's a perfect storm in that sense. We have both external shock as well as domestic demand shock, and the country is coping with that. Now, immediate impact as we have seen, is that the World Bank is projecting that there will be, and we also agree broadly with that. The IMF also is saying the same thing, that the growth will come down from 8% to 2% to 3% range in this fiscal year. And in the next year, there is wide difference between World Bank projection and IMF projection. IMF sees a very strong V-type recovery, which I doubt, and they're putting the growth outlook to be 9% growth, which I doubt. But I agree that it will be less than that, but more than what the World Bank is saying, which is about 3-4%. So that is the kind of outlook that we are seeing here. The impact of the pandemic is immediately, because following the lockdown, 15 million people lost their jobs, at least temporarily. And that has created a ripple effect on the whole poverty situation overnight. In our preliminary estimates, it's not the official estimate, the poverty probably have doubled from 20% is the upper poverty line we're talking about, to close to 40%. And all the gains, this we believe also, this is a temporary setback in poverty front, but it will not be fully recovered in 1 or 2 years. It may take longer than that. And much of this, the gains that were made in the last 10-12 years have been lost in just 2 months. And that's the sad part of this poverty story. And so what we are seeing is that the 3 major issues that the government has to handle in the coming months and in the next fiscal year. The first is controlling the disease itself, because as of now, the pandemic is still, the COVID-19 is still expanding, infection rate is still going up. We are still in the left-hand side of the curve and climbing. And we don't know how high this climb will be, where it will stop, and when it will stop. So these are big unknowns. The rate is still accelerating. So there's a lot of unknown, uncertainty arising from lack of control of the disease itself. Secondly, we have a major problem with what you call the livelihood issue, because the 15 million people who have became jobless overnight, if you multiply it by 4 as the family size, you're talking about almost 50 million people or 60 million people which have to be fed. And it's a major challenge. So we have to provide for livelihood support for a main, this 50 to 60 million people in the coming months. The government, yes, today I think has announced already a package for income support for 50 million people, and that should go somewhere there. But we have to wait out and see how it really being carried out. Secondly, is that the livelihood issue is very important because Bangladesh is fortunate in one respect. We have virtual food self-sufficiency. Our agricultural sector has not been impacted, and we're going to have a bumper crop of rice. And if rice is there, you can feed the people. So issue is income distribution, bringing the food to the table. So government has to focus on that aspect and put money in the pockets of individuals, and also buy some of this grain and then distribute it locally and in the cities and urban rural areas. So livelihood support will be a major challenge in the coming months and weeks, and they have to do it very soon, very quickly. The third issue is the recovery program. The government has already announced a major recovery effort in that regard. They have announced about 3.5% of GDP, a package of that for putting the economy back on track in the post-COVID period, in the recovery phase, which the opening phase. So, and that is about something like about 11 to 12 billion dollars in dollar terms. So we hope that it will be a starting point. At the end of the day, probably we'll need more money to support the full-fledged recovery of the SME sector, as well as the bigger industrial sector, and also provide support for the informal jobs to be created. So these are main challenges that we see the government has to face in the coming months. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mansour, for a really excellent and concise presentation. Appreciate it. So finally, let's now go to Dr. Patnaik in New Delhi.
Hello. Let me begin by thanking you, Michael, and the Wilson Center for inviting me for this talk. I just want to highlight the issues that we're facing, particularly after the crisis. So I wouldn't talk too much about the health crisis. We have numbers which are less than what we might have expected. So there were a lot of fears, but the numbers of deaths and cases didn't go up as much. Now, one of the things that was done, and which is the problem that we're trying to handle today, is that there was an early shutdown on 24th of March. I think the government took the decision that we have very poor health infrastructure. We don't know where the disease is. There's been very little testing. So we didn't really take a lot of time to prepare. And the shutdown was the period, the lockdown was the period when we were going to prepare for, some health facilities, some testing, and so on. So we faced both a demand and a supply shock. A demand shock because the lockdown was very, very severe. It was announced on 24th of March at 8 p.m. and from midnight that night, all travel, domestic travel, flights, trains, public transport, everything stopped. It also created something that maybe those of you who've been watching the Indian media are aware of, which is a migrant crisis. We have about 8 crore people. So a crore is 10 to the power 7, 80 million people are in cities working, who are migrant laborers, very often male migrant laborers who are not with their families. And suddenly they found themselves unable to go back home because public transport had shut down. Since the 24th of March, the government has been making an attempt to keep them in place, feed them, keep them in cities. while this lockdown has been in place, at the same time, the COVID cases and deaths have been rising. Today, they stand around 2,500 deaths and about 50,000 cases, roughly, the last time I looked at the number this morning. The government has now started announcing an easing of the lockdowns. The very first easing was done 21 days after it was announced, where rural areas were largely allowed to start functioning again. So it was harvest time, and suddenly there seemed to be a big crisis that, we are also self-sufficient in food. We have enough rice and wheat. In fact, we have perhaps our buffers are more than, food buffers are more than what we need. But then it was harvest time, and this was going to create a crisis. So that was the first thing that was eased, that is, that people could go to their farms and workers could harvest there. But in the subsequent lockdowns, the country was split up into zones. So there were district-wise, so there are more than 700 districts in the country, and about 130 of them were red zones, where the lockdown remained and was the severest, while in the orange zone and the green zone, most activity was allowed, and in the green zone particularly, activity was allowed. Yet, because that broke supply chains, because with the government trying to ease while trying to figure out the health situation, where set up containment zones, so there was this constant changing of rules, changing of geographies, in terms of what is allowed, what is not, which is a containment zone, because of which there was almost, in April, there was almost a complete collapse of the economy. I mean, it was something that was policy triggered, because we shut down demand, we shut down supply. There were the laborers were now getting very restless, and they started walking back. 1,000 miles, 1,500 miles, 2,000 miles, many dying on the way. And this whole situation is now got us to a point where perhaps some of the problems created during the lockdown are bigger. We feel, most people, government and people feel, are bigger than the actual health crisis that we had. So that's changed the sentiment in the country, and people are willing to, just open up. Though keeping social distancing, keeping masks on, sitting with a mask, just taking it out for this, and trying to, not make some things in place. But from the 17th of May, we expect to open up. Now, just on terms of the forecasts, I mean, most forecasts have been revised, and are now moving into negative territory, which was fairly obvious, but I think the foreign funds and their economists are often very polite, so they don't immediately jump to a negative forecast, even though it's fairly obvious that nothing is happening. But they're slowly, moving into -0.5, -1, and that's not surprising. The last thing I want to talk about is the package that has been announced by the government and what the government is trying to do to get out of this situation. There's a huge the announcement was that there would be a large economic package. Now, there was very little fiscal space to begin with. India was already above the targeted, we have a path for fiscal consolidation, and we were already above that before the crisis began. There was no fiscal space really. And some of the, right in the beginning, it became obvious that tax revenues are going to fall, and that we won't get any disinvestment proceeds, which we were banking upon to raise revenue. And there wasn't going to be, we have a big domestic market from which we borrow. So this market, the borrowing had to increase. The government announced an increase in its borrowing, but that would barely have made up for the loss of revenue. So the main focus of the economic package has been liquidity. While monetary policy did cut interest rates, did try to induce banks to lend, but the borrowers are not there. People are not willing to borrow, and banks are not willing to lend. So the package that has come in, and it's coming in tranches today. Yesterday was the first tranche, and today was the second tranche of the economic package, is mainly giving credit guarantees to give loans to small and medium enterprises because they are the biggest employers. The package also seems to be, though nobody says it clearly, but it seems to be giving jobs more in rural areas than in urban areas. One reason could be, and I'm only speculating, one reason could be that there is a fear that in urban areas we'll have to keep going, maybe have more lockdowns, because the worst spread of the disease is in dense urban areas. In Bombay, in the biggest slum of India, Dharavi, and so on. So perhaps I can stop now if you like, and then take questions later.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Patnaik, for that great presentation. So now we've all heard initial remarks from our speakers, and what I wanted to do now is move into the discussion. And just another reminder, those of you in the audience watching that would like to pose a question, please tweet it to our to the Wilson Center's Asia Program account, Twitter account, which is @Asia Program. You could also email your question to asia@wilsoncenter.org. And we have a few questions already, but I'm actually going to start with my own question first. And essentially, I'd like to broaden the scope a bit. And this is a question for anyone that would like to respond. I mean, we've drilled down on economic implications for the 4 South Asian countries in question here. But I was wondering if anyone would like to speak just a bit about what this economic stress that is clearly inevitable in South Asia coming out of the pandemic, what this economic stress and economic COVID-induced economic challenges in South Asia might mean for the global economy on the whole. So sort of taking the scope beyond the region. I think that could be a useful point to discuss. So would anyone like to address that?
Well, should I? Okay. What I wanted to say is that in the global economy, when most of the industrial countries have been slowing down, South Asia has been a relatively star performer. India has been growing very fast. Bangladesh was growing also very strongly. And in fact, while China was slowing down, so South Asia was being looked at as a major source of potential engine for economic growth for the global economy. At least it will be ahead of the rest of the others. But that expectation has been seriously dented by this pandemic. The collapse of growth in India has started even before the pandemic. That is true, and they had their own problems there. Pakistan has always been some problem, and in relations with IMF and all that, to restore, come back to normalcy and restore growth and all that. But Bangladesh was also, Bangladesh had no issue in terms of before pandemic. We are doing fantastic, but we have been badly hit from the back because of this COVID crisis. So I think in general, overall, the South Asian growth prospects have been dampened because of our internal problem, and in addition, we have this impact of the COVID, and that is not going to, it's going to have a lasting impact, or at least, in my view, I am not as optimistic as IMF chief economist Gopinath, who said that countries will be rebounding very strongly, including India and Bangladesh. But I doubt that we will have a sharp V shape. We will probably not. If anything, it will be much wider V shape, which will take at least 1 to 2 years to come back to where we were. Thank you.
Hi, Michael, could I say a few words? I agree with Dr. S, and I think South Asia, Asia itself was a major engine of growth, and I agree with Dr. S, and that I think the prospects for growth globally fall when South Asian growth falls down. I also think that there are interesting other spillover effects. One is South Asia, specifically with South Asia, was also a major destination for investment, both portfolio investment and other investment. And I think now this is going to fundamentally change flows of money, both for portfolio flows and other flows of money. And then so many other implications when you're talking about Bangladesh and India and Pakistan and and Afghanistan, also providing so many of the goods, especially the textiles, but a lot of the other goods, both intermediate goods and final goods for the West. What is going to be the implications, in terms of cost of production and cost of the goods, the final goods which consumers are going to get. So I think I think, it's not just how America goes and how Europe goes the world. It is now so much of growth is being generated in Asia. I think we can't underestimate the impact of what's going to happen in Asia and South Asia on the global economy.
Yes, please go ahead, Dr. Patnaik.
So the thinking in India is broadly coming from, I think, a lot of the discussion that's been happening in the world, that we might actually not slow down so much if we could strategically attract some of the investment that was going to China. That because of the growing mistrust that the world has about China, we might be able to attract some of the FDI, be part of global supply chains. And if we are able to do that, of course, I mean, there are many ifs there, and there are many things that one would need to do before this sort of vision or dream becomes reality. But the thinking is, and there's a lot of discussion going on about this, that if we are able to do that and we, tap into this moment, then we may be able to step in and growth may not slow down so much. This is quite an optimistic, ambitious vision, because we do have a lot of difficulties with our own system, with our infrastructure, laws, and it would need a lot of reforms. But let's just play the scenario that we are successful in doing that. Then in that case, if India, I'm not sure what the discussion in the other countries is, but if India is able to attract more FDI, then we could, of course, recover faster than we thought we would. Today, things look very dismal. Today, if we think of reviving what we had, that's very, very dismal, because that means pumping liquidity into a lot of the informal sector, small firms. But if we think it's not that we're going to go back to where we were and revive that, but instead we were to, the media is reporting that India is talking to 1,000 multinational companies and saying, we'll offer you land, we'll offer you easy entry, we'll make it possible for you to come in and start operations here. So if we are able to, being optimistic, if we are able to go down that path, it might actually be something that a good comes out of a bad situation.
Thank you very much. Great point to make. So let's go to questions from our audience. And we've got a few questions that are country specific and others that are broader. Let's go first to, actually there's several questions along these lines. Question about what are the prospects for the countries of South Asia, and I guess in this case, the 4 countries we're discussing today, to work together to address the economic challenges posed by coronavirus. And of course, as was noted earlier, there are significant political challenges that make it difficult for these countries to partner, even on a threat as shared and serious as the current one. But indeed, I think we'll all recall that some time ago, India's Prime Minister Modi convened a group through the SAARC countries to propose a shared response, though that was much more targeted on public health response than an economic one. But I don't know if anyone would like to address this issue of to what extent we can expect there to be grounds for some type of collective response focusing on economic recovery, or is it simply a pipe dream? And I know that you're economists, so I respect that. We don't need to get into the politics, but seeing this from an economic lens, are there prospects for collective responses?
Can I say something about this? Because probably I'm from Bangladesh as a neutral country in that sense, so in the sense of the polarized South Asia. We really welcome the initiative by Prime Minister Modi on the pandemic issue, the collaboration on the pandemic issue, and we thought that it would be a broader opening for many other things. And we really look forward to open trade regime between the countries, at least for goods, and that's also been not happening as of now. The goods from India has been blocked at the Petropol border for about several weeks now. The trucks, several thousand trucks are waiting there because the West Bengal government is not allowing them to pass the commodities on to Bangladesh. That's the major problem, because there's an issue between Indian central government and Indian state government. Central government has desperately been trying to open it up, but state government is putting a restriction on that. So that's an issue that's beyond our control, but this is a central fiscal federalist issue that needs to be resolved. But we have been impacted by even trade. Central government decided to make it goods shipped, like goods, basic goods like onion, through trains to Bangladesh border, because that is under the jurisdiction of the federal government of India. And that then offloaded to the trucks in Bangladesh part and then taken to other parts of Bangladesh. We depend very much on Indian trade and investment. Now look at investment situation. India is very scared. While Ms. Patnaik was welcoming investment, but they're very scared that a tiny investment in a small company by the Chinese created havoc in Indian media. And the government also issued a restriction that any investment from China will be considered almost like a hostile investment, would require prior approval and this and that. And not only that, even investment from Bangladesh, I can understand investment from Pakistan because of strategy. Investment from Bangladesh is also barred. They have to require prior approval from the government. So this is not the kind of environment that we would like to see. We would like to see more trade, more investment, both ways. Like Indians can invest in Bangladesh, no question asked, but why can't Bangladeshi can invest in India? It's not that we are going to invest there, we may not have money even, but issue is that is the principle. But we see serious issues. There's a lot of opportunities. We can trade in electricity, we can trade in goods, we can trade in services, we can trade in many things, but we have to have an open mind. We still don't have that, in my view.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's go to the next question, and this one involves issues of informal economy, which I think is a good one. What could be the impact of the COVID pandemic on the informal economy in each country, and what can each country expect in the way of increased criminal activities? Those are actually two separate questions. The question about informal economies is key because, as we know, informal economies are quite significant in all of these countries. So I don't know if anyone would first like to address the question about that. Yes, Dr. Pat.
So the package that was announced today was actually to address the informal economy, and you could see how difficult it is to try to address those problems. And I think that I'll give you a couple of examples on what the package tried to do. So you'll get a sense of how much time it might actually take to implement some of those things. So for example, there are street hawkers who need a small amount of working capital. Now, the package said that 10,000 rupees would be given, loans would be given by banks to these street hawkers. Now, we do know that it is expensive for banks to give very small loans, to monitor them, to recover the money, and which is why they often don't give credit to the informal sector. And the informal sector largely depends on informal credit channels through which they get loans. So a vegetable seller actually might get his working capital from the supplier who would give it to him and later give him things to sell on credit. So my sense is that even though it is being attempted that we take measures to support the informal economy, but these are going to be very difficult to implement. These are going to be partially successful, and the informal economy, so in India's case, it was already in trouble because we had demonetization, and then we had the goods and services tax. So this is like the third big shock to hit the informal sector, and I don't think it's going to recover very fast.
Yes, Dr. Chaudhary, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm going to jump back for 1 second, and I'm going to go back to the last question, which was also the idea of investment and regional. I think it was a very famous advisor of Obama's who said don't waste a good crisis. I think this could be a great opportunity to increase regional cooperation, especially as my colleagues from Afghanistan were saying, is that there's a huge amount of inter-country trade between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I think, and there is also huge potential for trade and trade routes from Central Asia through Afghanistan to Pakistan to India. But I think there are huge political obstacles. India, we're talking about Indian investment. India has just offered to pay for a huge dam, the Demer-Basha Dam, $3-4 billion. Just today or yesterday it was announced. So they want to try to get into Pakistan. Now, addressing Michael, your other question about the informal, I think there are going to be huge implications. Our estimates imply that about 75% of the job losses will be in the informal sector, number one. Number two is exactly as Dr. Patnaik was talking about, the government is trying, both through the monetary authorities and the fiscal authorities to address this. But exactly as she said, which is, you can, central bank can say, please give money, banks, please give money to, informal or S sector or firms or SME firms. It's just not feasible. There are multiple reasons. In Pakistan, there is also these issues about people not wanting to pay interest. A lot of the small firm owners don't want to pay interest. They're forgetting about, markups, forgetting about credit worthiness. And then, I think the government's direct interventions are trying to give people money, but we have this big program which was originally the Benazir Income Support Program, which is giving money to the ultra poor through women. That was 5 million recipients, and we've just gotten a handle on that. They want to give 12 million recipients direct payments, and these are 12, I imagine, million, or a significant amount of these will be different recipients. I think it's going to be very tough to try to give money or give assistance to the informal economy. Your last part, I think there is going to be a huge surge in crime. I mean, I think it's inevitable when you're talking about families not being able to feed their children, when you're talking about people not getting jobs. I think there's going to be, we were expecting in Pakistan, and I'm sure a lot of South Asia, a big increase in crime. And I think the government is unprepared because they're focusing on lockdowns, they're focusing on trying to help people, they're trying to focus on feeding people. The government is not capable of trying to police and help people at the same time. So I think that's a very important point.
Yes, Dr. Joya, go ahead.
Yes, just very briefly, I think the sectors that are sort of less vulnerable to these sort of shocks, I think they just happen to be more formal sectors, formalized. And then you have all these other sectors that are very vulnerable to these types of shocks, being supply side shocks or an exogenous shocks that sort of affects the whole economy. Those sectors that are more vulnerable, they just happen to be more informal. sectors like ICT or banking or mining, these sectors seem to be less affected by COVID-19, but then these sectors are just happen to be much more formalized. And I think given the very high rate of rate of informal economy in South Asia, I think the economic impact of COVID-19 is going to be much severe because it also sort of makes it difficult for the government to come up with sort of stimulus packages. But I think, especially in Afghanistan, as I explained earlier, the departing point for us was that we already had a very high poverty rate of 55%. That means that 1 in 2 persons were living below poverty. And unemployment, together with underemployment, they were both together at 40%. So this means that as we will go through this shock throughout this year, risks of social unrest, just like Dr. Chaudhry said, is going to be much higher, especially in very poor countries of South Asia, particularly in Afghanistan. And then I think the situation in Afghanistan with the conflict and security, it just worsens the situation and complicates the issue.
Well, thank you very much. So for the next round of questions, I'd like to pose a specific question to each of you, and I'll pose them right now. So, Dr. Chaudhry, there is a question for you. When many of us think about Pakistan's economic challenges, we think about debt. That has been a major struggle for quite some time, well before the pandemic. What does the pandemic mean for Pakistan's debt crisis? For Dr. Mansoor, Bangladesh, and you referred to this yourself before, Dr. Mansoor, Bangladesh has been described as an economic success story in South Asia in recent years. Could this pandemic have such a big impact that it could imperil that success story, or is it salvageable? And then for our Afghan panelists, there are fears that this pandemic could reduce international aid flows to Afghanistan because top donor countries, including the US, will themselves be severely economically encumbered. Is there a possibility, do you think this is a possibility? And if so, how could Afghanistan manage interruptions in international aid, given how dependent Afghanistan is on international support? And then for Dr. Patnaik, they're actually, we'll try to group these questions into one. Basically, there is a broad question as to how would you rate the effectiveness of India's response, specifically focusing on the gap between rhetoric and verbal assurances and actual delivery and results? And also, Dr. Patnaik, there was sort of a more specific question tied to that regarding the stimulus package. How expensive is it? Is it functionally comparable to the Paycheck Protection Program? And is there an estimated percentage of small businesses that could permanently close because of COVID-19? So should we go with the order that I posed those questions? Dr. Chaudhry, why don't we start with you, the question about the debt crisis?
Sure. Thanks, Michael. Michael wisely told me to keep our responses to a minute or so, because I could spend 2 hours on the debt crisis. There are 3 levels that you can answer that at. One is domestic debt. I mean, domestically speaking, right, interest rates are still very high. They've just come under, 10%. So when we're talking about, government debt, the government debt is crowding out a lot of the private investment. I think that's a major problem. There's an IMF program going on right now, so they can't overspend. But I think this high interest rates plus government borrowing is crowding out, and I think domestic debt is going to be a major issue for local investment and also for inflation. Now, I imagine also your listeners and your viewers are interested in international debt. Pakistan has borrowed a large amount of money, especially from the international financial institutions. We have these large payments because it's, you probably know, every 5 years we get back into this, into an IMF program, and we're still paying off our, our debts from the previous programs. So we're now borrowing money almost to pay off the previous debts we owe. The big issue is, how do we pay that off? Because obviously you got to pay that off in dollars or in foreign currency. We have a major domestic crisis. We don't have those dollars. We're borrowing to raise our foreign exchange reserves. And I think this is what Dr. Pataik was also talking about, which is this idea of, she was talking about the local migrants. I'm talking about international migrants. I think there's going to be a huge impact on international migrants, and also the amount of remittances coming back to countries like Pakistan. Our remittances are almost equal to our exports. So, this currency which is coming back is what we use to pay off our debt. So I think Pakistan is in a very serious situation in terms of its present international and local debt. And it's not an easy situation to get out of, considering the pandemic and the economic situation globally. The last thing it's worth throwing out there before I end is this whole idea of debt, the forgiving of developing country debt, and I think this seems to be picking up some momentum from pressure on these international organizations, World Bank, IMF, Asian Development Bank, forgive the debt. I think it's an interesting question. Do you forgive the debt? Do people fall back into their same old, problems of, just overspending and not having enough money? But I think this is something worth thinking about. Is the global economy at a stage that if you don't start forgiving debt in certain countries, people will literally just be starving, and large amounts of starvation and economic, disenfranchisement. So I think this is something we really need to think about also. But thanks, Michael.
Thank you. Yes, now let's go to you, Dr. Munster. The question posed to you was, could the Bangladesh economic success story be imperiled? Is it salvageable because of the pandemic?
Let me first apologize, because I got a phone call from our agriculture minister, and I had to take it because he said that he tried me several times and couldn't get through. So this time I took it because I needed him also on policy discussion issues. Coming back to, first of all, I think the salvation lies with how soon we can restore the economy. And I'll go back to the earlier question about the small and medium enterprises and the informal sector, because key to recovery also lies with them and lies with the recovery of the Western economies. Because a large part of Bangladesh economy export, as I mentioned before, is about 78% depends on only Europe and North America, and the rest in Asia. So we need the other countries to grow, to recover, and then we can also recover. That is from the external side. The domestic side, the recovery has to come from within. One is that agriculture is being a very big support. That's what I was discussing about the agriculture minister, about the harvester that they supplied, the government has supplied at subsidized rates to the farmers, is helping them cut at a very cheaper cost, and the labor movement is restricted. So harvesters are doing a fantastic job in this environment. Secondly, small and cottage industries has to be looked at. And the government has allocated about 300,000 crore or about $450 million for the micro and cottage industries. Those lending will be not done by banks. Those will be handled by microcredit institutions so that they can reach out to them, those small enterprises. The Bangladesh is a very fertile ground, and we have a lot of microcredit institutions all across the country, and their network is very strong and very good one. So that's a very positive development. Now, the other thing is that we have to also recover this SME sector. In our estimates, about 60% of those who have been unemployed are because of the lockdown and others, is coming from the SME sector. They are small factories, small shops, this, that, and so on. There, banks like Black Bank and several other banks which are specializing on small SME sector, they have hundreds of thousands of customers, each bank, for the SME sector. They can use pump-in money from the government, liquidity injection, and their own resources, refinancing and all that things, to bring about some positive changes around that. I'm a chairman of the Black Bank, So I had a long big meeting today, and we discussed about the strategy, how to pump in, because we believe that this SME sector has to turn around for the economy to get back to its previous level. That will be the key. That will be the first mover in our view, not the big industries. The first mover has to be the SME. So how do we pump in the money? We are developing the strategy for it. Government has given us some resources. We want to push that in the right way so that it can be done. We think we can be there, but we may not be fully there until the disease is controlled, because our main problem is still, as I've said in my opening remark, the disease is not yet controlled. We are still on the left-hand side of the curve, which is handy. And we have to look after, we have to strengthen our public health system, which has suffered badly because of lower allocation to that. Only 0.6% of our GDP has been spent on public health in the last 10 years, on average in every budget. That cannot continue. That system has broken down. We have to rehabilitate the public health system in a big way. That will be the main challenge also. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's now go to Kabul and hear from our Afghan panelists on the question of what cuts in international assistance because of COVID could mean for Afghanistan, a country which, as you mentioned before, is heavily dependent on international assistance.
Yes, that's correct. Afghanistan has been a special case last 20 years, and we are thankful to the very generous support by the international community. But the country now is in a very critical juncture, especially with all these 4 simultaneous challenges mentioned by Dr. Joya: the political, the economy, the conflict, as well as the immigrants will have a huge fallout on the region. A failure in Afghanistan will have serious national security implications for all of us in the world. I think with the security expenditure already declining for most of our NATO and American counterparts, I think there is a chance that we can transfer some to the civilian bill. And provided that the country is going through a peace process, I think that is further going to decline the cost of war. So this way, I think we can, in a sense, make some savings. And at the same time, there's going to be a Geneva conference on the Afghan economy later this year. And we are hoping that the international community continue with some further pledges to help us pass through this very critical juncture. I think it's a case worth investing for a little further until this peace process is succeeded.
Okay, Dr. Patnaik, let's go to you for the question on essentially the government's response and will the action match the rhetoric, and the specific question of how expensive is India's relief package, how does it compare to the Paycheck Protection Program? And there was that related question about is there an estimated percentage of small businesses that could permanently close? Some tricky questions there, but answer them as you'd like.
Let me start with the size of the package. Now, I think what is being referred to is that Prime Minister Modi made a speech 2 days ago in which he said that the size of the package will be 20 trillion rupees. And it was fairly obvious to anybody who's been looking at government accounts that this could not be the size of the additional fiscal spend. A lot of economists, particularly some very famous ones at American universities of Indian origin, have been very strongly advocating, a number of them have been very strongly advocating a very large fiscal package. So has the Confederation of Indian Industry and other industry lobbies like FICCI and so on. They have been saying that India should increase the fiscal spend part, so the fiscal stimulus, not just the full package, but just the fiscal stimulus by 5% of GDP. Now, what the Prime Minister announced, one might say a little cleverly, is that the size of the package, including liquidity that the central bank has been providing, is 20 trillion rupees. The package actually includes things like credit guarantees. So it's not that you increase the spend. And to be honest, I was quite relieved when I saw that it wasn't that the government was going to go out and borrow an additional 20 trillion rupees, which would be like 10% of GDP. I mean, it's not that domestic savings are going to go up by 10% of GDP, which would have meant that we would have borrowed an additional 10% of GDP from abroad. And even if, to some extent we borrow more from abroad, but not that amount. We don't want to get into now a macroeconomic crisis. I mean, it's enough that we have a health crisis, we have a demand and supply crisis, we have investment issues, but we don't need a macroeconomic crisis. So this mockery, if I may call it, or this insinuation that, the rhetoric and the reality are different is mainly coming from the fact that the economic package is not exactly an increase in fiscal spend. And I would say the government is being prudent about it. Yes, of course, there's always more that needs to be done. But if you don't have the money and then you try to do it, then you might actually get into more trouble. So that's on the reality versus rhetoric question. I think the second question was on the payroll program and how India's program compares with that. Now, ideally, if we had a database of all firms like Europe does, and if we had money to give firms to pay salaries to all their workers, then I'm sure we would love to do that. And any government would. I mean, in any democracy, which government doesn't want to be popular and take populist measures? But first, we don't even have a database of the firms. And second, even if we did, we didn't have the money. So what did the government do? The government basically said, we appeal to all firms, please pay your workers. And surprisingly, for at least a month, many firms did pay their workers. Some paid full, some paid half. It's not that everybody did. There was huge unemployment. So, no way am I claiming that people who were not able to sell anything were able to pay their workers. No, many firms were, just not able to or did not wish to. But the way it was handled was that please pay your workers. Now, that period has ended, we are now going into what we call lockdown 4, where it's not really that you're not allowed to produce. But now that period has ended, what has been proposed is a 3 trillion rupee package for small and medium enterprises that is a 100% credit guarantee. Now, as the rest of the economists on the panel would certainly understand, when you have 100% sovereign guarantee, nobody is ever going to return anything. No bank is ever going to go after anyone and say, return the loan. So what you have done is you've made banks who are reluctant to lend, though they have the money, to give credit to MSMEs, and then 4 years, 2 years later, 3 years later, repayments have to be made for 12 months. And then later, the money would be given by the government because it's 100% credit guarantee. After the default has occurred, it would be paid to banks. So these are the mechanisms. They create all kinds of moral hazard issues. It's not good for the creditors or the borrowers and so on. And, that's another whole range of issues. But in terms of you are trapped in this situation where you don't have the money and yet you want to provide it. You find clever ways of doing it. And I think that's what is being tried. And I've forgotten your third question.
The final question related to whether there is an estimated percentage of small businesses that could permanently close because of the pandemic.
See, I don't think at the moment anybody's made that estimate because we're still in the crisis. The COVID cases are rising every day, deaths are rising, nobody's come out with a vaccine. We don't know, we might have to have more shutdowns, migrant workers may not come back, and the story is not done yet. It's still unfolding. So no, we don't have an estimate of that.
That's a very good point. So as we move toward the conclusion, we have time for another one or two questions, and let me pose one now. I think this is a very good one. I don't think we can have any type of conversation about international affairs on the whole these days without bringing up China. So there's a question that goes like this: what do you see the role of China in South Asia going forward, given debt strains in Pakistan and Sri Lanka? Though of course there are other countries that have that problem as well, and concerns over supply chain resilience, especially in China. Now, of course, we know that we have the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is probably the most operationalized aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative. At any rate, I don't know if anyone would like to address that question of moving forward, what we could expect for China's economic role in the region.
There is a general level of realization that in the post-COVID period, the global supply chain, the global value chain has to change. It cannot be as dependent on China as it has been, inadvertently or for reasons of efficiency, both. And it has to change. That realization is there. Even the Chinese also realize that. And they are also moving out. They're trying also to move out of China, their own factories, because they want to maintain their export relations with other countries while relocating from China. So it creates on the one hand, there's a need for diversification away from China. It creates opportunity for South Asia, but South Asia has to compete with East Asia on that. Certainly Vietnam is a major challenger. It has attracted most of the FDI out of China as of now. Indonesia is another one, Malaysia, others. So there are Thailand, we cannot forget that. So there are major competing partners which will be trying to get this benefit of relocation. Problem with South Asia is that we are not really very successful in attracting FDI as yet. India has been to some extent, but not as much as it could have been. And as Ms. Patnaik said, that in future, that would be probably also for India to really pull itself out of the current situation. So we, South Asia as a whole, I think Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, all needs to create our own conditions, including availability of land, special economic zones, and all those things. And to attract those firms, be it Japanese, be it other countries' firms migrating out of China, or the Chinese firms migrating out of China. And we have to create that environment in our own countries. I am not particularly, these migrations are FDI driven, they are not debt creating, so that's not a problem there. The problem comes when it is bilaterally, officially funded big projects, like in Pakistan, like in Sri Lanka, like in other parts in Africa, and may also become a problem for Bangladesh in future, because we also have a big pipeline of bilaterally financed, foreign debt financed mega projects. And that may be a source of problem for future, because these projects are inflated in price. These projects tend to be we spend more than what you should, and the return may not be as high as anticipated at the initially. So we have to be careful in using bilateral resources, particularly from China in future in selected projects. But we need Chinese help because they have the money at the end of the day. Let's put it very bluntly. US is not willing to put too much money into these countries. Europe can give us some market, but not much money. China has money and market both, and investments. So they can really do a lot for the region. But India has a problem of its own vis-a-vis China. They have to sort it out themselves.
Thank you, Dr. Mansour. Dr. Chaudhry, I believe you wanted to say something.
Yes, thanks, Michael. I agree with Dr. Mansour. I think China is going to play a very important role. You mentioned the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which was your investments of up to 50 on paper, at least $50 billion or $60 billion to start with. What we see in terms of the experiences of the last few years, as Dr. Mansour was saying, is massive investments in terms of infrastructure and in terms of the power sector. And then now this announcement of the dam, there's been a lot less investment by Chinese businessmen opening up factories. And it's going to be interesting, which is, I think Dr. Mansoor and Dr. Patnaik discussed this, the enabling environment, the institutions, are these countries welcoming? It's one of the things limiting it. Another issue maybe it is how, China wanting to restart its economy quickly, how quickly then would you want to convince businessmen to move their factories from mainland China to Pakistan or to, Bangladesh or XYZ country? So I think China is going to play a huge role. I think China is going to start trying to pump money into a lot of economies around it, including Pakistan, potentially Afghanistan and Bangladesh. I'm sure they're going to try India. I know the Indians are a lot more reticent when it comes to accepting Chinese investment, but I think it's not easy to operationalize. Infrastructure investment is easy. You get it off the ground. The government gives sovereign guarantees. You're getting Chinese businessmen or and actually picking up where the Chinese leave off and being a part of the value chain is going to be a lot tougher. But let's see. I think the next few years are going to be interesting.
Yes, go ahead, Dr. Patnaik.
Yes, so as I had mentioned earlier, that one view is that we should be able to step in and attract FDI. There is another view, and that is that China is recovering pretty fast. Its corona crisis has peaked. Ours is, because of the shutdown, ours was postponed. So it might just be that while we are thinking of these optimistic scenarios of having attracting FDI away from China, what might just happen, and that's because of the fact that it hit them first, that what might just happen is that they're actually the ones on their feet able to step in, and we don't gain anything out of it. So I just feel that while we are discussing these issues, it's quite premature in terms of figuring out where the world is going till, at the risk of repeating myself, I would say till the health crisis is still unfolding, until we have treatments and vaccines. So India would definitely not like to see a China that becomes dominant, the thing that approvals should be taken because we had investment in a bank, and that was also portfolio investment in a bank by the Chinese. We went and said that even for FDI, you will need approvals. Then the government, of course, stepped back a little bit and said, within 15 days, we'll let you know whether you're getting the approval or not. So India wouldn't like to see a lot of, Chinese companies maybe taking advantage of the fact that, we have a crisis and buying assets cheap. But then that's not just India. I think a lot of that is happening elsewhere in the world as well. If you look at Europe, you look at the US, people are worried that China may step in and take advantage of the fact that you're selling off companies cheap, which might be becoming bankrupt in these days.
So thanks. We'll have to wrap up in just a few minutes. But I wanted to ask each of our panelists to offer a 30-second final comment, and through a question that I would pose to you this way: if you were each asked to give a briefing to your prime minister or president in 30 seconds or so as to what should be done right now in terms of economic policy, what would you say? So why don't we go in the order that we gave our opening remarks. So Dr. Chaudhry, why don't you weigh in very briefly to conclude?
I think so. I think 30 seconds is the only amount of time I would get with Imran Khan, our prime minister, but I agree. I think Dr. Patnaik has put her finger on it. This is not a crisis that is ended. This is something that may reoccur. There is no vaccine. There is no treatment which is in place. I think we have to expect a slow opening of the economy. We have to expect a significant increase in unemployment and poverty. We need to have the social safety nets in place to be able to get money into the hands of people. Recovering jobs is going to take a lot more time. You have to be prepared for a resurgence of this over and over again over the next 6 to 9 months. You need to invest in public health, and you have to be very, very sure, understand that, this balance of payments crisis, we're still in the midst of it. It's not going to end. my remittances are falling, and we have this budget constraint because of the IMF program we're in. So the government has to act smart, but has to act pretty nimbly right now.
Thanks. Our speakers in in Kabul.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of the policy advice, yet we haven't seen an economic policy from the government side. We encourage the government to come up with a Corona action plan, a national policy to fight the pandemic. That is still to be seen. Second is a social transfer to the needy, to the poor. It's the poor that cannot observe the lockdown for too long, and that will further exacerbate the situation. As it was already said, we are just postponing the crisis, but the poor doesn't have the luxury for too long to stay at home. I believe the soonest that people get out, and that's going to be any day soon, the situation will further deteriorate. So a social transfer program, be it in kind or in cash, is an urgent need in Afghanistan.
Thank you. Okay, and your 30 seconds, Dr. Mansour. You're on mute still. Dr. Mansour, you're still muted.
Yes, sorry, if I had this 30-second opportunity with the PM, I would say the following. First of all, there are certain things we cannot control, which is our destination countries, exports, and so on. So leave those aside. Focus on areas where we have the control. We have to have some degree of control on our disease management and the management of the patients who have been impacted by this, because that has been a major scandalous situation now. We have to spend more and rehabilitate our public health system. Secondly, I personally say that please don't go for in-kind food support program. We have abandoned this Bangladesh 10 years ago. We should have the infrastructure ready for cash transfer program. Go for it, because in-kind food transfer program is inefficient, corruption prone, and it is a waste of money. So go for the new instruments that you have. And thankfully, government has listened in part to that. We will keep on pressing so that more people are included into that cash transfer program. They started with 5 million. We want it to be 15 million. Let's see how it goes. Finally, I would say that we have to allocate more money for the SME sector, and we have to have partial risk guarantees. I don't like the Indian one of 100% guarantee, but at present we don't have any guarantee. And putting a lot of money to rehabilitate these small segments will be highly risky for the banking sector. So what I am pressing for is give us a 50% risk sharing arrangement, whereby we can really get this turnaround done. We don't want 100%. So these will be my simple advices to the government at this point. I will say, in your budget, which is coming, don't focus on too many things. Focus on these 3 important things and announce your budget. Don't dilute the budget by bringing 50 other issues. Focus on the key issues in this next budget. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, and last word goes to Dr. Patnaik. Your 30 seconds.
Yeah, I would first agree with Dr. Mansour that, and I would say that to the Prime Minister in my 30 seconds, that don't give 100% guarantees because you're going to mess up the system completely. But I would then say that, while we are fighting the COVID crisis and we are fighting the short-term problem, providing liquidity and so on, today this has given you the political capital to do deeper economic structural reforms. We need reforms in our financial system, in taxation, many reforms in governance. Don't waste this crisis. Use this adversity as an opportunity, because at the moment people will be with you and they will agree to a number of the reforms which have been held back because of vested interests, and this is the time to go ahead and do those as well.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Patnaik. I appreciate that. This has been a terrific discussion. We do have to wrap up. I really want to thank our panelists who took time out of their busy days and nights, really, Really appreciate you joining us. Thank you to our audience for your great questions and for listening in. For those of you that may have joined late and didn't see everything, we will have the video of this broadcast posted on the Wilson Center's website within the next day or so. So please, everyone, stay well and stay safe, and above all else, stay healthy. And thank you once again. We are now adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you,
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.